Hey guys, welcome to my channel. I hope you're all doing very well. So I just watched Loki episode 2. Let's talk about it. So another Wednesday has arrived, and you know what that means. Another episode of Loki has dropped on Disney Plus. Now, episode 2 gave us a lot to explore, a lot to sink our teeth into. Okay, so I have some thoughts on the events that occurred in this episode, so we're going to be diving straight into it. But before we get into it, as per usual, if you haven't already, please be sure to subscribe to my channel and make sure you turn on your notifications so that you can be told when I upload next. And be sure to tell me down below in the comments what your thoughts were on this week's episode of the series. But without further ado, now let's just jump right into it because we have a lot to discuss as per usual. So this week's episode starts off with the Minutemen on yet another mission, but this time around they find themselves in Wisconsin, I believe it was it Wisconsin? And they were in the middle of a Renaissance Fair. This was a fun little bit at the beginning of the episode because at first it seems as though they have landed themselves in the middle of what's actually the Renaissance period, and we already know that that's a possibility because they are time travelers. We saw just last episode that Mobius was in the middle of a church in the middle of the 16th century, and it's quickly revealed that this time around they are in fact in the 20th century, in the latter half of the 20th century, in 1985, and the environment that they find themselves in seems to be some kind of Renaissance fair as opposed to the actual Renaissance period. But this mission is being carried out by a unit of the Minutemen that we have yet to meet, and they are being led by, I believe, Hunter B90 was her name, but I'm not quite sure. But she was leading the team, and they ended up going into this kind of tent where they ended up having a confrontation with the Variant, aka this other version of Loki. Now I'm going to jump right ahead because the big reveal comes at the end of the episode, but I'm just gonna interject here and say I told you so. Just a quick little I told you so, because I knew that the Variant would end up being female Loki, aka Lady Loki. I predicted this last week, and I hadn't watched the second episode at that point because I didn't get the press screening for it, okay? So this was just my prediction, okay? This was just something that I came up with, so I'm patting myself on the back a little bit here, even though it was a pretty obvious prediction, but still I'll take the credit where it's due. But anyway, it does turn out to be Lady Loki, and she is the one who has this confrontation with this unit of the Minutemen, taking the leader of this unit away with her by the end of their confrontation. Now, it's during this confrontation that we learn that this version of Loki is able to take control of people's minds, and later on in this episode we do see Mobius going through all of these various versions of Loki that exists in the multiverse, and you have like Hulk Loki, Viking Loki, which is fitting because Norse mythology of course was born of Viking culture. But yeah, there are all of these references to these different kinds of Lokis, and the ones that we see in that scene are actually all male, and I guess that was supposed to add to the kind of shock and surprise when we find out that the Loki that we're following is a female. I would have been more surprised if it hadn't been something that we've seen in the comics before, considering the fact that Loki is a shapeshifter. Him taking on a female form isn't quite as, you know, shocking and out of the box as maybe they thought it was. But anyways, we do see these variant forms of Loki, and they are all male in this, I guess, slideshow that is a hologram. But at the same time, during this scene, Mobius does say that these various versions of Loki also have different power sets, and so that ties back into Lady Loki and the fact that she's able to control people's minds, which doesn't seem to be something that our Loki is able to do, because if you remember, if you recall from the 2012 Avengers, our Loki had to use the staff which had the Mind Stone inside of it in order to control the minds of Hawkeye and other S.H.I.E.L.D. agents. Now, the way that Lady Loki's powers are represented, it seems as though she's able to pass on this mind control via touch, and I couldn't for the life of me think of what other TV show or movie has a power set like this. I know I've seen it before many times. Like, I've seen it many times. It's a very common trope trope with magic and with magical creatures, but I can't remember specifically where I saw this kind of transfer of powers via touch and the kind of glowing eyes. Let me know down in the comments if you know any kind of characters or properties that I've done that similar kind of power set before, but I know they're out there. I know I've seen it before. But anyways, that's how her powers manifest. And again, it's interesting because she's able to do this using her own magic. She doesn't have to rely on an Infinity Stone the way that Loki did in the first Avengers film. And this kind of ties into the debate that Loki and pretty much no one else is having or entertaining, and that is the idea that he must be the superior Loki, and the variant that they're looking for, which at this point they don't realize is Lady Loki, must be inferior. So he's running around with his ego like, yeah, I'm the superior Loki, I'm gonna help you guys catch this inferior Loki. And Mobius is counting on that ego. He's counting on Loki's need to feel like he's superior, his kind of superiority complex. He's counting on that in order to get him to help, in order to get him to be on board. Now, I will say, speaking of power sets and skills, I was going to wait to bring this up later on, but I might dive into some other themes and forget, so we'll just put it here. The action sequences in this series so far, what do you guys think? Like, what do you guys think of the action in this series? Because last week I was very forgiving of the action sequences because, you know, it wasn't really about the action. I don't think that the series needs action, you know, all the time. But my thing is that if you're going to have an action sequence, make it good. Like, make it great. I just don't feel like the action sequences so far, and this is just episode 2, I could be proven wrong down the line, but I don't feel like the action sequences so far have been spectacular. And considering the action sequences that we have gotten in, say, Falcon and the Winter Soldier, that was so much more impactful. We have that iconic hand-to-hand combat that the Winter Soldier is known for in that series that still wasn't as good as the film version, but whatever. I just feel like in comparison, the choreography here, the ingenuity in the action sequences here, it's just not there. Like, it's not there. And I kind of forgave the series in last week's episode because Loki didn't have his powers because he was in the TVA, and so they were very much relying on the time manipulation to be the source of the action. But here he did have his powers, and near the end of the episode he uses them in such a juvenile and kind of underwhelming way that I was disappointed. I mean, at the end of the day, even though there are a lot of discussions of, you know, whether Loki is inferior, whether he's not really quite as great as he thinks he is, etc., etc., at the end of the day, he was still considered a godlike being amongst mortals, and so I expect him to at least be able to fight better than some random Jack or Bob from Alabama. There's no way that this random guy, even under the control of another Loki, should have held up against Loki, who's a frost giant, who's an Asgardian, or at least was trained by Asgardians, who has his magic in this scene. There's no way that this fight would have lasted more than 2 seconds if we were using logic. Like, if we were using brains, there's no way that Loki would have been pushed around by this Midgardian. So that didn't make sense to me. I really need the series at this point to start thinking about how it's going to address these action sequences, because what I've been seeing so far has been quite underwhelming. And I bring this up now, of course, because at the beginning of the episode we do get that confrontation between the unit of the Minutemen versus Lady Loki, and, you know, it's a fun little tussle, but like I said, it's nothing to write home about. I mean, it's not like the, you know, Falcon flying sequence where you're left with your mouth agape. Instead, this time around, it was like a quick little tussle that took place in a relatively dark, cramped space. And yes, you had Holding Out for a Hero playing out in the background, but that didn't really help make it feel like a cinematic experience of an action sequence. Okay, I've been talking for 14 minutes and we're still on the beginning of the episode. That's ridiculous. That's absolutely ridiculous. But to be fair, I have been bouncing back and forth, so hopefully this won't take 5 hours to go through. But next up, we do see Loki hanging out in the TVA offices in Mobius's cubicle, where he's got his feet up, he's made himself comfortable, and he's having a conversation with Miss Minutes, who's going through his training program. Now, because he wasn't pruned, despite Hunter B-15's wishes, he's actually going through this kind of training program where they're trying to teach him or perhaps indoctrinate him. We'll talk about that in a second, about the TVA's practices, the way that they function, their purpose, etc, etc. And he seems to be taking some of it in, but he's pretty lax and pretty, you know, nonchalant about the whole situation, not taking it too seriously, unlike the rest of the crew in the TVA. They're drinking that Kool-Aid. Now, it's during this scene that Loki finds a jet ski magazine on Mobius's desk that he uses to swat away at Miss Minutes. And Miss Minutes herself is a very interesting entity. Loki asks her whether or not she's a recorded message or if she's like an actual sentient being, and she answers with a little bit of both, which is interesting to me. Like, what does that mean? But in the meantime, Mobius does get Loki up and he tries to put him to work now that he was saved by Mobius in order to be useful in their quest to find this variant. He wants to get him to work and prove his usefulness immediately, and so he ends up taking him out on the field. Now, as I mentioned before, we do have this sequence where Loki learns of all of these different variants of himself, and Mobius is kind of listing them off and just showing how much of an expert in Loki he really is. But at the same time, Loki is standing there like, well, hang on a minute, I also know a thing or two about Lokis, like I'm one myself. And so he does mention, when Mobius is kind of listing off some of the power sets of the various Lokis, that, you know, he got one of the power sets wrong. It was a weird situation, whatever. It's all made up, it's fine. But basically Loki was kind of distinguishing the differences in the power sets that Mobius had kind of dismissed as being the same thing. And that reminded me of the very real interview with Tom Hiddleston and the rest of the Marvel Disney Plus gang. It was like Anthony Mackie and Sebastian Stan and Elizabeth Olsen, and they were just all in the same interview. I believe it was for Variety, and in one section of the interview, Anthony Mackie mentioned how Tom Hiddleston had a symposium for the character of Loki and they weren't invited to it. So the gang end up going to 1985, to the scene of the crime where one of the Minutemen was taken hostage by the variant. And this was a very interesting scene to me because I started to get these like alarm bells. I started to get these kind of bells ringing at the back of my head, like, where have I seen this before? This kind of crime procedural, police procedural setting for a traditionally evil character that has been portrayed in a lovable, charming way. Where have I seen this before? Was it not just a mere 2-3 weeks ago that I was describing this very same situation, except in the case of Lucifer season 5? Is this not the exact same thing? We've seen this before. I'd be very interested to see if this police procedural continues throughout the entirety of the series, because if you watch my review for Lucifer season 5, you'll know how I would feel about that. You would have some idea how I would feel about the entirety of Loki being a police procedural. I don't think it's going to be that. I don't think it's going to be that, okay? I just think this is a mechanism by which we can see Mobius and Loki working together, whilst at the same time following clues in order to figure out who this variant is. But I don't think that the whole series is going to be that. Please, please no. But again, I do highly doubt that it is going to be a villain of the week police procedural structure. First of all, because we don't have that many weeks. We're already a third into the show, if you can believe it. And secondly, because of the way that this episode ended, with Loki actually following Lady Loki, I think we have a chance that this whole police procedural layout was perhaps just for this episode. Hopefully. Hopefully. But it's during this scene that Loki shows his hand a little bit too much, because of course he can't help himself. He does resort to lying once more. He pretends like he knows that the variant is going to be outside, causing the whole unit to just stay put for way longer than they should before the branch reaches the red line and the Nexus event happens and it becomes irreversible. And yeah, they try to explain this whole time variant situation, but you know, basically they have a Nexus event, and if it gets out of control they can no longer reset the timeline and therefore restore the sacred timeline. Like, I think that's what's going on here. Fine, whatever. But he's stalling them in the tent for as long as possible because he wants to have an audience with the timekeepers. Now we'll put a pin on the timekeepers for a second here because I have some theories in regards to them, but But in terms of this whole scene, it's just a betrayal of Mobius's trust, basically, because he initially thinks that Loki is being serious, but then he realizes that he's lying, and he just gets a little disappointed. And I feel bad for Mobius, and I feel like he knows that he shouldn't trust Loki. He knows that he shouldn't put faith in Loki, because he will stab him in the back. Like, absolutely, he will betray him, despite what he says about stabbing in the back being boring to him now. He will absolutely betray him in some way, shape or form, but Mobius has a soft spot for Loki for whatever reason, and so he did actually trust him initially, but Loki quickly betrayed that trust by lying to him in front of the whole unit, in front of Hunter B-15, who already had her doubts. And was looking at Mobius like, you want to trust this guy? So after Loki blows that first mission, Mobius is kind of over him, like he's on his bad books at that point, and so he just tells him to focus on some work to do, make himself useful, otherwise he's going to end up getting pruned. He only has one more chance to prove himself useful. And so Loki buckles down and does some work. He's not like doing work, but he is at the same time. This is very interesting to me. It's weird to see the character of Loki from the Thor films flicking through files, engaging in bureaucracy. Like, it's just bizarre. But in the meantime, whilst he's flicking through the files, he does come up with this idea that maybe he can find out more about the TVA and about the entirety of time. So he goes to this kind of librarian and asks her for all of these files, but she tells him that they're classified and the only file that he has access to is his own. And it's basically a written version of the video file that he watched in last week's episode, and we see just as much of a visceral reaction via Tom Hiddleston's great acting in this scene where he reads the details of Ragnarok, of the end of Asgard, the apocalypse that brought Asgard to its knees, and he has this very emotional reaction. The tears are kind of held back because he has a very complicated history with Asgard and with Thor and his family and everything, so there's a lot of repressed emotion in that scene. It's not quite the same as him seeing his mother die right in front of his eyes, but still, you know, you saw a tear almost fall. Okay, he was getting a bit teary-eyed, but then afterwards it's because of him reading about Ragnarok that he realizes that it's possible that this variant of himself might be hiding out in this apocalypse, and he tries to explain this using Mobius's salad. He gets a hold of Mobius's salad and puts a ton of salt and pepper in there to try and explain this analogy. But his main theory is that the variant is hiding in an apocalypse, this kind of apocalyptic event, which means that no matter what he does or she does, as we later come to find out, it wouldn't really affect the sacred timeline because the apocalyptic event was supposed to happen in the first place. And so, you know, who cares if you add a bit of salt when the whole thing is going to get washed over by juice? It won't really make a difference, and therefore it wouldn't alert the TVA of any Nexus events. So that's a pretty clever way to kind of circumvent the idea that you have this TVA that should be able to catch the variant wherever they go. So then Loki persuades Mobius to test this out on the field mere moments before Vesuvius is about to erupt in Pompeii. Now this whole scene is fun, okay, this whole scene is cute. Throughout the entire episode we see a very kind of falsely jovial Loki. You know, truly the god of mischief, okay? This is the side of Loki that we didn't really see a lot of in the Thor films, because especially when you had these serious events happening, like in Thor The Dark World, you didn't really get that side of Loki a lot. You got hints of it, and that's something that a lot of audiences latched onto. But here in this episode, like, he's just fully god of mischiefing. I do feel like that's all a performance in order to kind of give Mobius a false sense of security about him, especially because he clocked onto his betrayal earlier on. Loki just wants to be back on Mobius's good books so that he can carry out his mischievous plan as per usual. So they go to Pompeii in 79 AD, and they were only supposed to spark a very small kind of deviation in the main timeline, but instead Loki's out here letting goats out, okay? He says, you know, be free my horned friends, which is, I'm guessing, a reference to his horned helmet. But yeah, he just goes wild. He starts speaking in Latin, telling them exactly what's about to happen, and the people in the town are like, who's this crazy man dressed the way that he is? Like, he's making himself a very obvious variant. But it turns out that doesn't matter, because mere moments afterwards Vesuvius erupts and the entirety of Pompeii is left to dust. And so Loki's theory theory is proven right, and Mobius and Loki are really excited about it. But it turns out that that's just the first step in finding out where the variant is, because they also need to find out when the variant is, because it turns out there are a bunch of catastrophes, there are a bunch of apocalypses to choose from. Now, here's a very interesting scene here. I couldn't help but notice that a lot of the catastrophes or apocalypses that were named here were natural disasters, and this seemed to be kind of tied to the natural disasters that scientists predict will be happening more often and more frequently as a result of climate change. But this time around, it's Mobius that's able to add to this theory, because he figures out that the chewing gum that he got from the little kid who was in that church in last week's episode is a good indicator for when this Loki is actually residing in. And so they're able to narrow it down to when the chewing gum was actually sold, and they narrow it down to Alabama. I believe it's 2051, just before the whole place is flattened down by a hurricane. Now, before we get into the last scene where they're in 2051 trying to find the variant, I did want to discuss some of the conversations that were taking place between Loki and Mobius, because as I mentioned in last week's episode, I do think that there are some interesting philosophical concepts and themes that are being explored in this film through their dialogue. And one of these themes that I couldn't help but notice in this week's episode was this kind of theme of religion, perhaps? Okay, so hear me out here. My theory is that the TVA is some kind of metaphor for religion. I think that the TVA is a metaphor for religion, and I think that through the characters of Mobius and Loki, as well as the other members of the TVA, we are exploring different perspectives on religion. In the case of Loki, as I mentioned in last week's episode, he very much is against the idea of predeterminism, the idea that these three lizards would be able to create the sacred timeline that would determine everyone in the universe's lives, and that everyone's destinies would be completely out of their own control and in the control of these three lizards, that being the timekeepers. Loki isn't buying it, okay? Loki isn't buying it, but as I said in last week's episode, there is an element of hypocrisy there, because he wanted to do the same thing to the people of Midgard, but he believes that he's one of the few people in the universe that can make their own decisions, and that does deserve to have a free will and therefore exercise that free will. So there's definitely an element of hypocrisy there, and that's just where his ego comes in. But there is this interesting discourse that's happening with the character of Loki that kind of contradicts or goes against what Mobius believes or seems to believe, and that is the idea of the timekeepers, you know, having written everything that's going to happen in time, or at least up until a point, apparently, because as we see in the discussion between Judge Renslayer and Mobius, the timekeepers may not have completed the entire sacred timeline. We'll get to that in a second. But yeah, I did see some very interesting parallels between the TVA and religion, or at least a cult or something. For example, earlier on in the episode, we see Loki referring to the training program that he gets at the beginning of the episode with Miss Minutes as propaganda, which to me, that's more than just an organization doing its job. Like, if you have actual propaganda, you're trying to indoctrinate people. And as I said earlier, it's not about the training, it's about the indoctrination, which is interesting. And when Loki is trying to convince Mobius that he has turned to the good side, he says it's because he believes in the sacred timeline. So it's this idea of belief. It's not enough to just be on the good side. Like, you have to actually believe in this stuff. And I think, of course, using words like belief connotes to religion and religious beliefs. And another thing that, of course, reminds me of religion and themes of religion is, of course, the fact that the timekeepers created the TVA, and apparently everyone that works in the TVA. And that explains why last week's episode we saw one of the TVA employees mentioning how he'd never seen a fish before, he didn't know what a fish was, and that's because they don't really have lives of their own. Their whole purpose is to work for the TVA in order to ensure the maintenance of the sacred timeline. So again, it's giving me very heavy cult vibes slash, you know, devoutly religious vibes. And in the case of Mobius, we do see, as I mentioned earlier, that he had this magazine, this jet ski magazine in his his cubicle. But when Loki asks about it, he mentions that he's never actually ridden on a jet ski. He just knows about it. And so first of all, I think at some point in the series, we're going to be seeing Mobius on a jet ski. Like, we need to have that moment for him. Like, you can't just leave that hanging, right? And secondly, that tells me once again that it seems as though these guys were literally just born to serve the timekeepers and to maintain the sacred timeline. They're not people with autonomy in their own right, and that makes sense because they believe that these timekeepers have predetermined their entire lives to begin with. Now, another thing that also made my ears perk up a little bit was the introduction of the theme of existential nihilism. Listen, something that you should know about me, okay, and the reason why I got so excited about this is because I am someone who believes in existential nihilism. Now, we're not going to get into the philosophical debate in this video because we don't have the time, but I was really excited by the phrase that Mobius used in this episode, where he said existence is chaos. Like, there is chaos in existence, but they have tried to find meaning in this chaos, and they've tried to find purpose in this chaos through the TVA and of course through the timekeepers. That's really fascinating to me, and again, it has echoes of religion, the idea that, you know, humanity may have created these religions in order to find meaning in the chaos of their existence. Now, next up, we need to also address the scene that takes place between Mobius and Judge Renslayer. We see the return of Gugu Mbatha-Raw's character from last week, where she was putting Loki on trial, but this time around she is cozy in her office full of artifacts, and at the center of that office there are 3 imposing figures that are carved out beautifully in, I believe, wood, and of course those are the timekeepers. Now, again, religious elements here. I mean, to say nothing of the fact that in the first episode we saw an actual church, but in this case we see the way that the timekeepers are depicted in this office. It's very lavish. It's giving me Catholic Church circa Renaissance era, right, with the stained glass windows, with just the lavishness of the way that they are depicted like gods, like you would a religious figurehead. And so to me, that's what also draws in this kind of view of the TVA being more of a religion as opposed to just an ordinary organization that is very functional, because you need to have that belief in order to put so much work and so much art into the depiction of the leaders. And most notably in that everlasting lift slash elevator, if you're American, that lift is crazy. I believe it's an actual hotel in Atlanta in America, which is insane to me, but that is absolutely stunning, seeing how long that lift is at the center of the offices. And then of course you have once again those imposing 3 figures, and again that's very much giving me church vibes, the way that those 3 figures are carved into stone with such detail. That's something that you would see in a lot of Catholic churches. It's given me very Sagrada Familia in Barcelona. But going back to the conversation between Renslayer and Mobius, we do also learn a few interesting things in this scene. First of all, Renslayer is kind of slapping Mobius on the wrist a little bit because of the first mission that he went with Loki with, and also about the fact that he won't use a coaster. And they seem to have quite a camaraderie between them. They seem to have known each other for a very long time, so the conversation is pretty casual considering the judge's position in the organization. Now, this is where we get to my other theory my other theory about this series, my main one actually, and that is, I don't think the timekeepers are real. Hear me out, okay? First of all, going back to the religion analogy, we'll leave that there, okay? I don't want to offend anyone, I don't want to ruffle any feathers, but I would find it interesting if in this series, considering the kind of religion analogy and the kind of parallels that they're drawing between the TVA and a religion, it would be interesting if ultimately the gods of the TVA weren't real. And the reason why I think they're not real is because of actually another series that this very much reminds me of, and that is Snowpiercer, which is the TV show version of Bong Joon-ho's film from 2014. That film is excellent. The TV show, not as much. But going back to the TV series, I couldn't help but see the parallels between Judge Renslayer and Jennifer Connelly's character in the show. I feel like they may be playing a very similar role. role. And it's just the way that Judge Renslayer was speaking during this scene, the way that Mobius was kind of asking her about what the timekeepers think of all of this. He's never met the timekeepers personally, even though he seems like he's a detective that's pretty high ranking, like he seems like he has a lot of respect in the organization, but he's never met the heads of the organization, which is interesting. And Judge Renslayer is the only one, perhaps, or at least in this kind of subgroup, that has spoken to the timekeepers directly. And the way she was like, oh, they've never been as interested in a case before, like they're really invested in this. And also later on, when Mobius is asking about, you know, how the creation of time is going, and Judge Renslayer is like, yeah, they're working really hard to finish off the creation of time so that we won't have to worry about these Nexus events ever again. And to me, something didn't feel right. Something didn't feel right. I was getting strong Jennifer Connelly vibes from Snowpiercer, because for those of you who don't know, who haven't watched Snowpiercer, the big twist in season 1, major spoiler alert for Snowpiercer season 1, by the way, but the big twist is that there is no captain. Jennifer Connelly's character is actually the captain. So in that series, again, they have this parallel between the captain being the god of this new world, which is essentially just this very long train that's holding the rest of humanity. And everyone thinks that this captain is like this, you know, god, and they're so grateful to him. They're almost like worshipping him because he created this train. But then in reality, it turns out that it's Jennifer Connelly's character who's supposed to be the lieutenant, who's supposed to be the kind of, I guess, you know, the assistant, the head of HR. I don't know what she's supposed to be, but she's not supposed to be the captain, but it turns out that she is the captain. And so when people find out, they freak out. They don't trust her with being the captain, but they trust this, you know, other person who used to be the captain, to be fair, but then something happened. Again, I wasn't a huge fan of that series, so I can't remember. But I'm starting to suspect that this might be the case for the character of Judge Renslayer in this series as well. Maybe she's the one who's driving this train. And so with that in mind, going into the final scene where we finally see Loki confronting Loki, Lady Loki, and Loki is trying to kind of proposition her and say, look, we could band together to take over the TVA. And Lady Loki is like, I don't want to take over the TVA. And to me, that means she wants to destroy the TVA. And her actions following that scene prove that to be the case, because she's been gathering these kind of time devices, the reset devices that the units of the Minutemen take with them on their missions. And it turns out that she's been doing this in order to create this massive bomb that would create splinters in the sacred timeline, causing the TVA to be stretched thin, I'm guessing, so that they would have to go and address all of these branches from the sacred timeline and weaken their powers. So I think that's how she was trying to approach destroying the TVA. But we'll see what happens in next week's episode. Of course, we did see Loki jumping into one of the doorways with her, so we may be seeing them interacting in next week's episode. We may even see that scene that we got in the trailers where everyone thought that it was Natasha in Vormir, but in actuality it's likely to be Lady Loki and Loki having a discussion, perhaps about her backstory, who knows. But that's it from me. Now that I told you guys my thoughts on Loki episode 2, it's time for you guys to let me know what you thought of this episode down in the comments below. Please be sure to subscribe to catch new videos coming up. Thank you guys so much for watching. I really appreciate it, and I will see you in the next one. Bye!